The teachings on the seven rays have been an increasingly popular teachings, especially in certain circles in the last century and a half. But they're actually an ancient teaching. They're more prevalent in some traditions than others. Variations exist in the nature of the teachings about how many rays there are, for instance, or exactly what their nature is. For instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a version that is essentially called the rays there as well, and other names. There is generally considered to be 5 rays in that teaching. The basic idea, though, is the same as the more common 7-ray systems that are popular, especially in the West right now. But the 7-ray version is actually quite ancient too. Perhaps the most notable versions are to be found in some of the Asian teachings, particularly in Hinduism. The notion, though, of the rays that I'll be talking about, and this is a general introduction to the notion just for people who are interested in a general overview of the concept of the teachings on the rays, but also for those who might particularly be interested in a more in-depth exploration. I'm in the process of offering a live webinar on the 7 rays. But for those who may come across this and perhaps become interested at some other point in time, that webinar will be available as a recorded teaching later as well. So this is just a kind of general overview to help people have a better understanding of the notion of the rays in a very simple foundational sense, but also where they come from, what the broader context of this teaching is, and what its value is, what kind of application what practical use can the teachings of the 7 rays be put to. So one of the simplest ways to understand the nature of the rays is that they're essentially facets of enlightenment. It's as if we imagine enlightenment as like a sun emanating luminosity. We could discern within that fundamental enlightenment, the white light of illumination, different colors, different qualities, different facets to that wisdom and energy that is the expression of enlightenment. And so, in a sense, one perspective would be to say that the fundamental wisdom of enlightenment has 7 flavors, 7 aspects. And these arise because at the relative level of our experience as human beings and as sentient beings in the universe at large, there are various facets or basic kind of dimensions of reality. And so as enlightenment arises within each of these dimensions or aspects of our nature and the universe around us, it takes a corresponding flavor that derives from its interface or relationship with that dimension of experience. So, for instance, if we look at this, the notion that we have 7 chakras or energy centers in our subtle body, these are focal points for different aspects of our nature. And if we illuminate each of these centers, if we awaken spiritual consciousness in each of these centers, it will take on a corresponding quality and type of intuitive wisdom that corresponds to that chakra. So that's one way of understanding where the rays arise from. These are often this notion of rays and whether they're conceived of as, however many there may be considered, like 2 of the main systems around are 7 or 5. But these systems are very similar in that they, the way they understand the way that the rays arise and the way qualities that they have, basically similar. And the spectrum of these qualities is indeed reflected in the chakras. So one way to develop an understanding of what these rays are is by starting with the experiential foundation of the chakras and the aspects of human nature that are related to these chakras, and then to develop a deepened understanding and through intuitive exploration, through spiritual practice, of what is the inner luminosity, what is the underlying spiritual essence, latent and inherent in each of these dimensions of experience represented in the chakras, for instance. So that's a way that we can use the microcosm, our individual nature, to discover these universal principles that also are reflected in the universe around us. The rays are part of a larger teaching that recognizes in this case, a septenary division, a 7-fold division to reality. And this reflects in many different ways. For instance, in the Hindu tradition, there's a notion of 7 worlds or lokas. These are dimensions of reality, the physical reality that we're most familiar with as human beings being the sort of densest or most accessible realm or loka. So these are sometimes called planes or dimensions or worlds. And in this case, the Hindu term is loka. And in that system, there's 7. And these 7, that's an aspect of a kind of system that views the 7 as repeating and reflected within itself and within the universe and within human nature in many different ways. Another system of 7 are the chakras. Well, of course, there's disagreement in different teachings about how many chakras there are, but one of the common systems is 7, which I would tend to resonate with, because for me, this 7-fold system is sort of in the same way that physical science will look for patterns, look for some kind of objective sense that underlying the ordinary experience and the day-to-day nature of phenomena. There are patterns, there's structure, there's order that can be discerned. That's not just kind of a idiosyncratic way of organizing reality, that we can try to be more objective about it and study that, discover that. In the same way that that's true, and that's become apparent through modern science about elements of the physical world. Spiritually, many believe that that same kind of order exists throughout the full spectrum of states of consciousness and dimensions, and in relationship to subtle energies, chakras, subtle bodies, qualities, that in many different ways there is discernible order. And of course, it's a little bit more difficult to discover what that is than through studying, the type of knowledge that comes through application of that approach to the physical world. It's a little bit more easy for humans to sort of test that knowledge. There's a subjective element to the inner sciences, the inner intuitive consciousness sciences. Nonetheless, so that's why there's some disagreement about these things still, and that's probably going to go on for some time. So what I'm offering is essentially a kind of version of, for instance, in this context, an understanding of the rays. That is simply my best understanding based on over 40 years of exploring this theme, both in terms of exposing myself to various points of view about them, both Eastern and Western, ancient and modern, but also, most importantly, exploring them in my own experience, in my own spiritual practice, and in my work in the world. So we see this septenary system, which is something that, there's a long version to the story of how I've come to sort of a deepened appreciation or resonance with the point of view of this being one of the basic aspects or ways to understand realities, that they're building blocks to relative experience, both in the physical world and in the subjective dimensions, and that they can be sort of viewed through different lenses. Of course, one basic lens is the polarity of reality, the basic duality, Shiva and Shakti, yin and yang, masculine and feminine. Through that lens, we can sort of see a perspective of reality where there's order that can be revealed. That's a fundamental aspect of relative experience. And so this septenary system is simply another point of view. It's another important recognition of a certain structural order behind not only our physical experience, but the fullness of all the subtle dimensions that make up relative life. Now, of course, behind that all is a more non-dual transcendental truth, out of which all of these are more of a kind of phenomenal manifestation. And so to truly understand the system of the rays, we ultimately need to see it in that light. We need to understand that these are qualitative manifestations of enlightenment born out of a recognition of ultimately fundamentally non-dual nature of reality, the Tao, Buddha nature. So that ultimately has to become a very deeply important part of this science from my point of view. I think the clearest, most liberating recognition of the nature and significance of the notion or the experience of these seven principles or rays comes from that context. But as I was saying, this notion of seven rays is part of a larger teaching. It includes the notion of seven worlds, seven chakras, and a variety of other principles of nature and human nature, elements. Typically, many ancient systems teach 4 or 5 elements: earth, water, air, fire, and so on, akasha or space. In this system, it's understood that there are actually 7 elements. It's a little bit unusual take on that, but and so the rays relate to these other septenaries, these other systems or patterns of 7, and they're different in one sense in that they arise through the illumination or transformation, the awakening. If you take, say, one of the elements, say the earth element, which has a dualistic quality, it arises within the dimension of experience that we might call samsara or relativity, a dimension of dualism and veiledness, you might say. If you awaken or transform and liberate that element into a corresponding type of wisdom and qualities that you are imbued with, if you become enlightened in relationship to the earth element, which is a dimension of experience and life, then you get a corresponding ray quality and wisdom, which we might call the 7th ray. So that's one way of understanding what these rays are, is they arise through the awakening of our ordinary experience. So the sources of these rays are multiple, but the most essential foundation is that they're awakened within us. They are an expression of our own awakened nature. And they arise in the context. They have these different aspects because our relative nature has different aspects. And the essence, there's that one enlightenment, one realization. But on the surface, it can take different attributes, different qualities, different flavors of wisdom because of these differences. Now, this is very useful to understand on a relative level, because although in people's spiritual path, they may they're we can have a sort of general sense that there's a fundamental underlying similarity to the nature of enlightenment. How people approach that awakening and how people express it is also conditioned by their relative nature. So not everybody's on the same path. And these paths can be very powerfully understood by understanding this intuitive science of the seven rays. We could say essentially that because there are seven main facets or principles to human nature, seven chakras, seven elements, and so on, that similarly there are seven awakened states, awakened qualities, and wisdoms that correlate to those aspects. And that gives us seven primordial or fundamental approaches to spiritual awakening, seven types of people. So that's another key aspect of the power of this notion of seven rays, is that each of us tends to resonate more with one of those, especially in our spiritual nature. There's a fundamental attunement that lasts even over lifetimes, a kind of depth of connection to a particular style. And on the surface, we may explore all the other, in our nature, all of these are going to be present, all these facets of enlightenment. But still this underlying key kind of leaning is there. And hence, we see many traditions, like a very common distinction in the Hindu tradition is that's a sort of popular way of talking about a couple of basic approaches as the Jnani and the Bhakti. Ramakrishna or Ramana Maharshi would regularly refer to and compare Jnanis and Bhaktis, the path of the Jnani, or Jnana Yoga, the path of wisdom. Would be more like inquiry, or some of the techniques of Buddhism, for instance. These are kind of wisdom paths of observation and mindfulness and insight and awakening. Whereas the Bhakti path is more of a path of devotion and surrender, of faith and love. It's kind of a more feeling-oriented path. And that's so those are kind of following that earlier, that reference to a basic dualism that we could find also in reality. The Jnani and the Bhakti are kind of like fairly universal versions of the two paths. But at the level of recognizing seven fundamental styles and qualities, and from that point of view, we could say actually we can subdivide that further into seven basic styles. And it can be useful to do that because there can be a tendency amongst, on any given path, we all have seen this, that, a person may feel very connected to a particular style of spiritual awakening and maybe develop the opinion that that's the best way, and maybe even to a point of kind of denigrating other paths. And part of the power of the seven ray vision, especially the non-dual version, that is something that I've been keen on deepening understanding of, is that from a sort of more radically non-dual point of view, these are not, none of these rays is sort of superior. We don't move from lesser rays to better rays or anything like that in our development. It's more that these are all equally valid approaches, and they all lead to a fundamentally essential transcendent awakening, self-realization or God consciousness. And that in fact, ultimately, a kind of broadening out and developing all the rays is very powerful and important. But in order to do that, in order to be able, especially for teachers, for instance, to kind of recognize differences in different people and what approaches, what philosophies, what insights and practices resonate, and what qualities are they going to be most inspired by, because that becomes a key for them. And then as they grow, as we all go through different stages of awakening, we tend to broaden out, appreciate other facets, develop other qualities. So a very important and powerful aspect of understanding the notion of seven rays is it's a recognition of seven basically different styles of spiritual development. Of course, most paths combine various elements, so it's not a black and white kind of thing, but very few paths are well represented on all seven rays. There's usually some kind of combination that are preferred, certain qualities and aspects that are emphasized, and others are sometimes completely, rather undeveloped. So understanding, for instance, various techniques and practices and what rays they emphasize can be very illuminating and practical, have practical value in a variety of ways. My own exploration of the teachings of the seven rays began around 40 years ago. I first encountered the teachings through a Western esoteric teacher, Alice Bailey. And for several years, I explored her teachings in depth, as well as a variety of other things, especially Buddhist teachings and Hindu teachings and so on. But I found some real value in the teachings on the rays that I encountered there. Then I went through a period where, as I was shifting to a more fundamentally intuitive approach to life and spiritual practice, I decided to move away from relying, in a sense, too much on external ideas and shifting to basing my understanding more on my own immediate experience. And one of the things I discovered, interestingly to me, was that this, even though I kind of purged my mind of a variety of teachings that I had absorbed, but maybe weren't necessarily rooted in as deeply as they could be in my own experience. After this purging, I found that not only did the rays persist as something that I found actually was very deep in my soul already, as if these teachings weren't just something I had taken in externally, but they actually were kind of now coming from within myself. But I also began to experience intuitively that there was a richness to understanding them that went far beyond what I had been exposed to so far. And so that began a process of various stages of expansion in my intuitive understanding and experience and actualization of these different ray aspects. Over the years, too, I also became increasingly exposed to a variety of other teachings, and with regard to the rays, there were some that were particularly enriching in that regard. One of those, for instance, was Tibetan Buddhism, and is Tibetan Buddhism, especially, for instance, in certain teachings like the Dzogchen tradition. There's explicit reference to the rays. They talk mostly about five. They call them the five pure lights or the five luminosities, etc. But in essence, it's a very similar teaching, and their understanding of it shed some beautiful and powerful light on the notion of the seven rays, even though there's a slight difference in things like the numbers and so on. Daskalos, Stylianos Aptishlos, one of the great Christian esoteric teachers in the 20th century, also taught from a system of seven. He didn't speak in terms of rays so much, as far as I know, but he had a kind of corresponding idea that also had its own impact. Vedic astrology has powerful correspondences, and in fact, I discovered that the terms that Vedic astrology does specifically speak of seven rays. It's a very similar concept as we find in some of the modern Western esoteric teachings. And I discovered, as it turns out, that these teachings are the same. The terms that Blavatsky used as an early, this is sort of a predate teacher to Bailey, who I mentioned. She actually used, this is the same Sanskrit words for the rays as they do in Vedic astrology. So clearly there's a powerful connection there between those two teachings. So as I studied Vedic astrology more deeply, I discovered another perspective that really shines a light that not only kind of meshed pretty well and reinforced some of what I already understood, but also added a whole other dimension of richness to that understanding. So various teachings like that from Eastern teachings, especially Hindu and Buddhist, as well as Blavatsky, Bailey, and other Western teachers, Daskalos. These combining with my own experiences, a lot of the foundation upon which I developed my current understanding, not the least of which is I'm also an active participant in the sort of underlying tradition from which some of these sources like Blavatsky and Bailey receive their inspiration as a member of the same tradition. There is a sort of active participation in a path and a system of understanding that, although I'm sure each person has their own unique style of understanding what that is. If you look at, say, Bailey's, it's not exactly the same as, say, Vedic astrology. It's not exactly the same as Blavatsky. Each person brings their own special flavor to it. But nonetheless, there's a core inspiration that's similar, and I feel deeply tapped into that same source. And that's been another source of input for me, as my inner participation in that lineage, my contact with members of that lineage. It's something that I often just refer to as the planetary lineage, because many of the inner members, and some of them who are physically incarnate, they don't tend to quite as strongly identify with particular local lineages in the parts of the world that they live in, such as India, or the Middle East, or there's members throughout the world. There's a lot of them in Asia, of course. So they may outwardly be connected to Hinduism or the Sikh tradition or Buddhism or Christianity, but inwardly, many of these people are actually part of what I often call the planetary lineage, because they have a participation in a kind of trans or non-sectarian global community. And these teachings on the seven rays are actually very deeply rooted in that lineage. In fact, they view those teachings as very fundamental to their understanding. In fact, there's a passage in one of Blavatsky's books, The Secret Doctrine, which was co-wrote with two of these great ones, these behind-the-scenes adepts that lived in the 1800s. And there's a passage in that book where it said that this system of a septenary understanding of reality is one of the actually most distinguishing characteristics of their teachings, because they share a lot in common with a lot of existing traditions, especially Asian traditions, in their recognition of a fundamentally non-dual view of reality, a fundamental polarity of yin and yang, Shiva and Shakti, nirvana and samsara, a spirit of bodhisattvahood in the path, if you use the Buddhist terminology, or kind of engaged spirituality rather than an otherworldly orientation. These are widespread themes, whatever the terminology may be, across the community, the members of this community throughout different cultures. And similarly, a very pervasive universal part of their teaching, it's kind of like a core part of their spiritual cosmology and science, is the septenary division of nature, which not only includes chakras and worlds and principles and so on, but also the seven rays. So having been a lifelong participant, as well as in the past in different ways, I kind of draw a lot of my understanding from that kind of that relationship, let's just say, my participation in that lineage. So that's a general overview of my approach. It's based most fundamentally on my own experience and my own, it's not a channeled teaching the same way some people have put out teachings that are kind of more emphasizing an inner connection. I am influenced by those relationships, but I prefer to sort of ultimately integrate it in my own experience and have it ultimately be rooted in that and arising from that. So I not only draw on those spiritual connections, but also different external sources that I mentioned, like different traditions, different specific teachers. But ultimately, it's all digested and transformed and tested out in my own experience. So that's the foundation of it. And subsequently, my approach has, you know, a variety of unique aspects to it. My feeling is that what I feel is the value of what I have to offer is that it is a kind of integrative approach to the seven rays that draws on a variety of sources, and subsequently has the benefit of a kind of added richness for those and other reasons. So I will put a link below for anybody that's interested in going deeper into this particular approach to the seven rays. Thanks for your interest.